How long, Lord? How long will injustice reign while the righteous cry out and go unheard? How can a God of justice allow the wicked to prosper while the innocent suffer? These are not new questions. They're ancient ones, questions that haunted a prophet named Habakkuk as he stood at the ruins of a society crumbling under its own corruption. Chapter 1 of his book captures a raw and honest conversation with God, one that wrestles with the divine silence, unimaginable answers, and faith that refuses to look away from the darkness. If you've ever found yourself asking tough questions about where God is in the chaos of life, then Habakkuk's words might feel strangely familiar. Today, we're diving into a chapter 1 of this short but powerful book. Get ready for a confrontation with doubt, divine justice, and the surprising ways God moves in history. Welcome to this week's episode of Biblical Bites. Let's get started.
Adam, we're back.
We are back.
So we wrapped up an episode this fall, or excuse me, not an episode. We wrapped up a series. Let's start over.
No, I don't want to start over. I want to do it just like I want the people to get the real
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, come on.
We haven't been here for
You know what I was thinking the entire time you were speaking?
What
in the world was the series we did?
Right?
I cannot remember.
It was Acts. Okay, so
It's
everyone's
only been like a
forgotten
month.
my faux pas of saying saying episode instead of series because you can't even remember what
I
our
can't
last
even remember
series.
what our series was.
It was over Acts.
Oh, have we read that book before?
Yeah. Well, you know what, though? In your defense, you have a lot of different things going
whatever.
on. You're teaching something on Sunday night. You're
That's
preaching
no
on Sunday
excuse.
morning.
I should at minimum remember the last series that we did.
Well, it's been a little bit of a rough start this morning. We're trying to get back into the swing of things.
Oh, yeah.
And not only have we been off for several weeks,
A couple months, really.
Yeah. But also this week hasn't been normal for anyone in our area. So hopefully we have some listeners from places other than Southeast Texas. But if you're listening from Southeast Texas, we're recording the week of the epic snowfall of 2025.
The record-breaking, a second most in history, right?
Yeah. So we are right on like Texas-Louisiana border.
Mm-hmm.
And we never get snow, really. If we get like half an inch, we cancel school and we play in the icy...
For the hour before the sun comes up and melts it away. Yeah.
But this week at my house, we got over 5 inches of flurry snow. We built snowmen.
That's crazy.
We did snowball fights.
Oh, yeah.
We made snow ice cream. I've been seeing pictures from all over town. So the funny thing is, though, we had snow on Tuesday morning. It's Friday. Your kids are still out of school.
I don't want to talk about it.
Like we just
our school system was like, you know what? You had a snow day on Wednesday. Could have done like a 2-hour delay on Thursday, but was like, we're done for the week.
But that's okay. That's how we do snow in Southeast Texas. We get it like once. You're not even probably going to be alive.
You know what?
The next time
I'm
we
really
get it
nervous
like that.
when we make statements like that because I feel like it's just an opportunity for God to just be like, yeah, you thought that was it? Like,
you know what?
And then next thing you know, we're going to break the 30-inch record here in the next couple weeks.
I would not be sad about that. I had so much fun.
I had PTSD. Look, I'm from up north, and the winters just mean I'm going to overeat and be depressed and yearn for warmth and sun. It is not joyful memories for me. So we did it. My wife is amazing at making sure that we unlock all those core memories for our kids. But for me, I'm like, it's cold. Everything in the house is wet. We've blown through so much laundry.
Sure.
I'm like, woe is me, unfortunately. But
it was not a new, exciting thing for you.
It's pretty. It is pretty. I love looking at it for about a minute, and then I'm like, okay.
Well, in my household, I have a 12-year-old boy, and he did did
he ever come inside?
No, not the first day. By the third day, he was a little done with it. It also was melting by then, so it was wet. But the first day, he spent all day outside. And when he couldn't feel his toes anymore, he would come and put on another layer of socks and go back out or whatever. But at the end of the day, we walked down our street to this field that the school district owns at like an alternative campus. And no one had really walked through that field. And so it was still just that pristine, beautiful snow. And so he and his cousin just kind of raced through the field and made snow angels, kind of repeated all the things they'd done in our yard. And he looked at me and he said, "Mom, if it's this beautiful and this amazing today here and like so much fun, can you imagine what heaven's going to be like?"
I hope no snow.
And so, well, for him, maybe it will have snow. But, it was such like this kind of renewed amazement for God's creation and what joy felt like to experience something new. And it was kind of like one of those piece of heaven on earth moments, or a glimpse of heaven for him. And that was really fun to see through his eyes.
That creates a good juxtaposition between his outlook in the unexpected and my outlook on the unexpected.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So so Habakkuk is not going to experience that glimpse of heaven or glimpse of joy in the book of Habakkuk. It's actually going to be kind of opposite for him. He's going to look around and think, could we get any closer to hell?
Yeah.
And so this book really intrigued me. You asked me what we were going to do for... You're so good because you're so easygoing, which is kind of opposite of my personality.
You mean desperate to not have to put a brain cell to something?
No, you're just willing to learn and easygoing. And so you just kind of left it up to me, and I just was really, I wanted to do a book that wasn't we weren't well versed on, and probably our listeners weren't well versed on. Just kind of challenge ourselves to just look at something that we haven't looked at before. And Habakkuk really jumped out to me because it's a book of the Minor Prophets division, but it's different from all of the other prophetic books in the Bible in that it's more of a conversation with God. And God Habakkuk asks hard questions. It's not, in fact, Matt Chandler explained it as an uncomfortable conversation. And I love that God invites us into this uncomfortable conversation between Habakkuk and he. Because, I think the questions that Habakkuk asks are questions that are on a lot of our hearts. And maybe we're like Habakkuk and we have asked God some of those questions, but I think more of our listeners are probably like me and didn't realize I was invited to ask God the kind of questions.
Our culture is very much one of pride, and when we understand that we're fighting our own culture here, we often, when speaking with God, try to come at him with kind of a humble, mindset, which is good, I think, in a way. But at the end of the day, like, the Lord knows what's on your heart, and there seems to be something to the idea of lamenting, lamenting the real tough stuff, and I think of it a lot like my relationship with Lauren. We can have a really beautiful and deep relationship. But when times are joyful, but it's when we get into those real hard and tough conversations and tough moments and having to deal with those things emotionally and figure out how we support each other in the midst of those things that really the deep connection begins, and I think that's like sort of the purpose of like the lamenting type writings and things like what Habakkuk's going to talk about here. It gives us an opportunity to really just take things deeper, to express those things that are on our heart that the Lord already knows that we're dealing with, but an opportunity to kind of voice that. And in Habakkuk's case, he gets a response, which is obviously not something that we're all privy to, but I think in reading this, we get to glean so much more about who God is and about his love for us, even in the midst of those uncertain times.
So we don't know a whole lot about Habakkuk. We do know that just from the language that he speaks to God and the way God responds to him, that he was a believer, that, like you said, he had a close relationship with God, which I think is why he felt invited to converse with God in the way that he did. But what we do know is that Habakkuk was a prophet of the southern kingdom of Judah. And I think that it's interesting that that's really all we know for sure. And we know some about the context of what was going on in Judah at the time, but as far as what we know about Habakkuk, it's really all we know for sure. And I think that in a way could be on purpose. Because it's not about Habakkuk. It's about who God is in the face of Habakkuk's questions. And these are questions that people have had across all times and places. And so I imagine, though, that Habakkuk was a little older when he wrote this. And the reason is because it seems like to me his questions and his conversations from God come from a lot of life experiences. And so I think that he was probably older. His contemporaries would have been like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and also Daniel. But I think Daniel probably would have been younger and reached his prime a little bit later after Habakkuk wrote the book of Habakkuk, because we see Daniel's going to be a major player in Babylon. And so let's give some context to what's going on in the southern kingdom of Judah and in the world.
Yeah, so you mentioned the southern kingdom of Judah. For those who maybe aren't super familiar with the Bible, the history of Israel is a pretty complex one. But from a 40,000-foot view, ultimately what happened is, if you recall, starting like maybe at King David was like a big united kingdom of Israel, which is where we look at, and when we see Israel on the map today, it'd be kind of like similar to that kingdom. His son Solomon would expand that a little bit further, but ultimately, because of the sin that they would struggle with, there would be a division in the midst of this kingdom, and it would split after Solomon would split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah. And Israel, by the point that Habakkuk is written, has already dissipated. The kingdom of Assyria has come in and has ultimately ripped them out. The tribes that belong to those northern kingdoms would kind of assimilate into the world, unfortunately, at that time. And so the kingdom of Judah, which is actually where Jerusalem, the house of God, the temple of God, was located, is kind of holding on by a thread. And their period of the kings would kind of fluctuate, some good, some bad. But where Habakkuk is believed to be most likely written would have been before Babylon comes up and takes over Assyria. And so Babylon is starting this process of overtaking this world power. And it's kind of being seen in the geopolitical forces of the time. Once that occurs, they will then come in a couple different waves and in the early 6th century and ultimately lay demise the house of God and the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Habakkuk is here in this period of time right before all that occurs. So it's like there's not to quote Daniel, but there's like a writing on the wall that seems to be playing. Now that is not where Habakkuk is writing. He's not writing about the kingdom of Babylon or the kingdom of Syria. He's actually writing about the corruption that he's seeing in this southern kingdom. Yeah. Notice he's lived and heard the stories and experienced the histories and the fall of the northern kingdom. So he knows what happens when corruption sneaks in. And we'll get back to that corruption, I think, a little bit later. But that's kind of where we're at. So in the middle of this section of what we would call the minor prophets, what the Hebrew scriptures would call the Book of the 12, because all 12 of these prophets were just smaller and could fit into one codex. So you've got the big three, and then you've got the Book of the 12, and in the middle of this Book of the 12 is where this is falling. And so a lot of these minor prophets are dealing with, various versions of kind of what Habakkuk is dealing with, mostly discussing about repentance and the downfall of what is to come of either the northern or southern kingdom at that time. And so Habakkuk is a very unique book because it's just a conversation with God, and it really separates and sets what Habakkuk is doing versus some of the Book of the 12.
And you did such a great job kind of informing our listeners of where Habakkuk's eyes were facing. Like he saw the Assyrian Empire weakening and Babylon coming up in power. But where he had come from, most likely, was the reign of Josiah. And Josiah, he was actually one of those few godly kings in Judah. In fact, we like to teach Josiah to the kids because do you know how old Josiah was? Do you have a guess of how old Josiah was when he became king?
Was he like 13 or something?
He was 8.
8.
He was 8 years old. And so he became king when he was 8 years old, and he actually reigned for 31 years in Judah. Now, and he is seen as a good king. He did a lot of good things. He actually followed the Lord. He reinstated Passover. He reopened the temple. His reign of 31 good years came right after 60 evil years. So you have 60 evil years in Judah, then you have these 31 years where Josiah is just bringing the nation back to the Lord. And on top of that, during Josiah's reign is when Assyria was weakening, like you mentioned. And so a lot of the religious reforms that Josiah wanted to put in place were made possible because of Assyria's declining in power. And so, and I think Josiah's mom at 8 years old, I don't think he was wise enough to, put a lot of those good decisions in place. But the Bible kind of states that Josiah's mom and Josiah's maternal grandfather, they followed the Lord. And I think that she just began pouring into him and his leadership from a young age. And God blessed Josiah's reign. And Habakkuk lived during that time, we're pretty sure. He experienced what it was like for the people to turn back to God. He experienced revival. He saw Assyria, who, like you said, had oppressed Judah for over 100 years, weaken in power. And then he sees at the end of Josiah's reign, what happens is Babylon comes to destroy Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. And they destroy Nineveh. And so Assyria picks up and they move their capital to Haran, another city. And while they are in Haran, about 2 or 3 years later, Babylon's like, okay, we're going to take that capital city too. The Assyrians are going down, so we're going to take Haran. So Babylon starts marching to take Haran, and Egypt comes to Assyria's aid. Well, Egypt wants to go through the land of Judah, wants passage through the land of Judah to get to Haran to aid Assyria. You got me so far?
Yep.
So now King Josiah has to make a decision. Does he allow Egypt to march through Judah to aid Assyria, or does he stop their passage? And he chooses to stop their passage because he was afraid of two things. One, either it would look like Judah wasn't sovereign, and they had gained a lot of control back from Assyria as Assyria had weakened, and they were getting to make their own laws and things like that. So he didn't want to threaten their sovereignty. And two, he didn't want to look like he was colluding with Egypt because he didn't want to become a target against Babylon.
Yeah.
And so he tells Egypt no, and Pharaoh Necho of Egypt and King Josiah meet at the Euphrates River, and Pharaoh Necho kills him. And that's the end. Yeah. As quickly as Josiah lived and died, a lot dies with Josiah, and evil kings reign in Judah after that.
Yeah, so Jehoahaz is one of them, and he only reigns for like 3 months. Right. And then right after him is Jehoiakim, which he was actually installed as the next king under Pharaoh Necho the second. So now we have Egypt installing kings in Judah. Ultimately, what's going to happen is the king Nebuchadnezzar II, who we'll know from Daniel, is actually going to take over the official kingdom of Assyria in the Battle of Carchemish in 605. So this is somewhere in the midst of this like 11-year reign of Jehoiakim, probably between 609 to 598. There's Egypt is slowly building up its power. Assyria is falling. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar now is rising up, and yet Judah is seeing nothing but the exact opposite of what Josiah did. We're seeing like a rebuilding of the idolatrous temples and statues, and we're seeing corruption take place in the priesthood, and all of these things that we'll get to again a little bit later. But that's where we're at. So we have Habakkuk, who's experienced the highs of King Josiah. Now he's watching ultimately his whole nation, what seems to be fall to political unrest, to religious unrest, to corruption, which is another reason why I think Habakkuk is a really important book, because I think most Americans specifically kind of get this feeling a little bit. They kind of get this feeling of, this is not the America that we used to know, for better, for worse. It just feels like things seem darker and more distant from the ways that we used to know it. It seems like it could use God's intervention, in a much greater way. And it's really similar to the way Habakkuk would be feeling at this moment.
Absolutely. Just really confused. And so, I think when we think about everything that Habakkuk had lived through, and keeping in mind, he loved the Lord. He wanted, in fact, most scholars think that Habakkuk was a professional prophet. Like that's what he did full time. He had invested his whole life in calling God's people back to God, and it was going so good. And then it wasn't. And when it got bad, it got really, really bad. And so now that we have set the stage, let's go ahead and look. We're just going to look at 11 verses in the book of Habakkuk. So if you think we've already been talking 20 minutes and we haven't even gotten into verse 1, it's okay because we're not taking big chunks like we did in the book of Acts, right? And so if it's okay with you, I'm going to read Habakkuk 1 through 4. Perfect. The pronouncement that the prophet Habakkuk saw. How long, Lord, must I call for help and you do not listen, or cry out to you about violence and you do not save? Why do you force me to look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Strife is ongoing and conflict escalates. This is why the law is ineffective and justice never emerges. For the wicked restrict the righteous. Therefore, justice comes out perverted.
So Habakkuk is he's lodging his complaint.
Yeah.
And his complaint is that God is just standing back and he's watching this corruption take place. Now, I have this neat little chart that kind of brought together using the writings of 2 Kings, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, sort of what all were going on at this time. And so I felt like this was really helpful for me. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to talk about it. So during this specific period of time, what we're seeing, 2 Kings writes slightly before him, but 2 Kings 21 talks about the adultery and the religious apostasy. Ultimately, under King Manasseh, who led Judah, led them by rebuilding these high places and erecting altars of Baal and placing these idols inside the temple of the Lord. This happens kind of a little bit before him, but Jeremiah is going to write during this exact time, and Jeremiah condemns Judah for forsaking God. It says that they forsake the fountains of the living waters, turning to idols, and they are described as building broken cisterns that can't even hold water. So that's how Jeremiah 2 describes it. And Ezekiel says that they engage specifically in idolatrous practices in secret. Very specifically, the elders of Judah were doing this. So in behind closed doors, Ezekiel's talking about the practices that are happening at this point. So there's idolatry and there's religious apostasy. Then there's also social injustice. So they're not acting okay religiously, but then they're also not protecting the weak and the vulnerable. Jeremiah 7 says that they were oppressing the alien, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows, and they were shedding innocent blood. And then there is also, lastly, moral decay and injustice taking place. Jeremiah 6 says this, that there was widespread corruption in Judah, where everybody is greedy for unjust gain. From the prophet all the way to the priest, everyone deals falsely. It's critiquing their inability to feel shame for these detestable practices. And lastly, Isaiah 1 tells us that Judah was used to be full of justice, but now speaking specifically of Jerusalem, used to be full of justice, but now it is ruled by corrupt leaders who love bribes and neglect the fatherless and the widows. So, I mean, they're literally failing at all accounts as a nation and as the house of God themselves. And this is what Habakkuk is talking about. Like, God, what's happening? How long am I supposed to cry for help? These people aren't listening. It's getting worse. Like, how long will you idly stand by? Which keep that word in mind, that idly. Watch. How long will you, verse 3, idly look for wrong? Because that's going to come back into play again a little bit later in the book.
I think it's interesting that you pointed out how many major prophets were speaking into this situation. And really, we kind of see Habakkuk acting like God is doing nothing.
Yeah.
But it seems like to me that he's sending multiple prophets. I mean, these aren't silent years for God's people. In fact, I think when I read verses 2 through 4, when I really meditated on them, I kind of came to the conclusion that I feel like they're definitely a lament, but it's almost like a lament with a crescendo. Like they grow in intensity. Yeah. So verse 2, I feel like Habakkuk's just kind of acting like God is apathetic. He's accusing God of being apathetic. He says, I'm crying for help. You don't listen. I'm crying out about the violence. You don't save. So it's like almost like this emotional tone that depicts, like, I think about, just because I'm in that parenting stage in life, but I think about like a child in distress, just crying, asking for rescue. And the perception is the father's just ignoring and refusing to save despite his ability to do so. And And then verse 3 seems to almost take it up a notch. So not only is Habakkuk saying, God, you are just being apathetic, but I feel like in verse 3, he kind of ups it a level and says, God, you're just being abusive, because he says, why do you force me to look at injustice? So it's like the verb there is accusing God of acting upon. Habakkuk's accusing God of acting upon him. It's like he's forcing his eyes, holding his head to watch injustice. And I looked up that word, injustice, and it actually is an interesting word. The root word of it means to like work in vain. In other words, like a hunger that can never be satisfied. Or one of the synonyms was pant. Like think about just like a dog just panting and like wanting water and not receiving it. And so I think that he's gone from just saying, God, you're not listening to me, to now he's saying, God, you're like forcing me to watch this misery of like a hunger that can't be satisfied, a thirst that can't be quenched. And when he refers to, this is just a little side note, when he refers to violence, do you know what the Hebrew word for violence
Hamas.
is? Yeah. Where else have we heard that word in current
Genesis?
times?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Hamas over in that's happening over in Israel and Palestine.
Yeah. So right now there's a terroristic group called Hamas that is oppressing Israel. And interestingly enough, it's not the same word, but it is a homophone, a word that sounds the same. The terrorist group is actually an Arabic acronym. So HAMAS, all of those have Arabic words, and Hamas makes up the acronym. But I don't think it's a coincidence that we can see some cultural relevance in a homonym from Habakkuk.
I did a word study on Hamas when I read that violence is in this twice, just in those two verses, and it's used only 60 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, which seems like a lot, but it's really not for this one word. And the first usage of this is in Genesis 6 when describing the way that the whole world was. It was covered in all, just completely corrupted and covered in Hamas and violence, which of course, you know what happens there. God's going to destroy. He's going to wipe clean. He's going to decreate creation in order to start new with a remnant. And you know that Habakkuk, who would have been steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures, at least specifically those that Moses would have written at that time, he knows he's very intentionally going to be using this Hamas word.
Yes.
So God, where are you? Bring in the flood of justice at this point.
Yeah.
And protect a remnant.
And I love that you pointed out how Hamas would have been such a core idea to Habakkuk, because we're going to see. So I mentioned that I feel like verses 2-4 read like a crescendo, and that's a good example of how it's getting more and more heated, more and more real, more and more accusatory in Habakkuk's mind, because he goes from verse 2, apathetic God, verse 3, abusive God, and now I feel like verse 4, we're going to see that Habakkuk accuses God of being inept, of being unable. And here's why I think that. He says the law is weak. It means the Torah. The word there, law, is Torah. The Torah is weak. It's literally a picture of weak in the knees. It's the same word that's used to describe Jacob when the sons tell him that Joseph is alive and he falls to his knees. It's like the news was more powerful than his resolve.
I like the ESV's translation. It's paralyzed.
Okay.
It's paralyzed.
So I think let's know, like, Habakkuk's dealing with like some core things about the character of God and who he is, right? And he goes on to escalate that. And he says, in the second part of verse 4, he said, for the wicked restrict the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. These ideas of justice and righteousness are huge in the Hebrew Bible and in Old Testament times in Habakkuk's understanding. He's not saying something small here. It is an extremely important idea in Bible times. The coupling of justice and righteousness, in Hebrew, the words are mishpah and zedek. They are an important pairing. In fact, zedek and mishpah describe the perfect rightness of God in all that he is and does. And the concept permeates and shapes Scripture. That's a quote from Douglas Bookman. He's a Bible scholar. And so just to kind of illustrate to you why those concepts, which appear lots of times together, are so important, so foundational to the character of God, I think Psalm 89:14 is a really good verse. It says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of God's throne. And we're going to see in 1 Kings 10:9 that when Queen Sheba goes to visit Solomon, she actually says, "Blessed be the Lord your God. He delighted to put you, King Solomon, on the throne of Israel because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel. He made you king to carry out his judgment and his righteousness." These were things that were just core to who God was in the minds of the people in Bible times. And I don't want you to think about righteousness in terms of Western righteousness. Western righteousness has a lot to do with like equality, like making something that was wrong right. But in Bible times, that was a shame and honor culture. So justice and righteousness had more to do with bringing honor back to the shameful. And it was just a key thing. And so here's what Habakkuk is doing. So don't miss this. Habakkuk is accusing God's righteousness of being restricted and his justice of being perverted. In fact, he's questioning the very stability of God's throne. He's saying, God, are you sovereign? And Habakkuk's extremely honest about that.
I think it's interesting because so oftentimes, like I'll use the idea that we base our understanding of God's characteristics off of our human experiences. So for instance, if you grew up in a home that was fatherless, it's difficult for you not to project those emotions of what a father's love that you've experienced onto the Creator. Whereas God's love is by characteristic full and complete and perfect, you almost have a corrupted idea of what the love is from the start. So it's difficult not to see your father as a, maybe a distant, abandoned, character. Whereas if you grew up in a home that was super strict and you did have a dad, but he was very much about, punishment or whatever it may be, military type, understanding, you may see dad or God as this God that you want to make sure is happy with you at all times. And if not, he's going to be judging you or punishing you. So we reflect or project these understandings onto the characteristics of God. And here we have Habakkuk, like we've already talked about. He's surrounded by like what he's experiencing in his own human life. So those who are supposed to be religious are actually super corrupt and standing by while things are occurring and happening that are wicked. So it's almost like he's projecting the same actions of those who are supposed to be interceding on behalf of the people onto God himself. Are you not acting like the priests that we are calling wicked or the institutions that have failed us? Are you not acting like those unjust kings that have ruined your kingdom? God, are you going to act like the way that we're seeing these humans act? Or are you going to act like God, who we know is faithful, who's just, who's loving, who's going to be consistent from the start? So he's testing God's ways versus the human ways and seeing whether God is going to act just like another one of those human ways, or if he's going to act like God should act in the way that man thinks he should.
Yeah. So I like that explanation because it really made me think that, and we're going to see this throughout the book of Habakkuk, that there is a difference between interpreting things through your lens and interpreting things through the truth. Yeah. And that's going to be an ultimate question, an ultimate concept is through what lens? Because the lens may be the problem, not the picture.
Absolutely.
So let's see how God answers, because this is like, man, I don't know. Like, how do you, if you had not read, I know you've read the rest of the section, but like, if you had not read, I was getting nervous for Habakkuk the first time, that I read this. I'm like, oh, it's coming down on you. Like, you can't talk like that to God.
I would have felt that way, but I've read Job and I've read Jonah and I watched previous to this, and I've watched God. Well, first of all, what actually I was mostly surprised about is it took Jonah the entire book before God answered him.
Yeah.
Here it took him 4 verses.
Well, and I do feel like, and God absolutely shows his patience and his faithfulness and his gentleness with those, with Jonah and with Job, but he's even more so. I'm going to let the cat out of the bag before we read the verses. He's even more so patient in general, I feel like, with Habakkuk, because like he waits a while to answer Jonah, right?
Yeah.
He makes him pretty uncomfortable in the meantime. Job, he does answer, but he's like pretty straightforward. Like I think at one point in the book of Job, he basically says like, put your cup on and get out there and fight like a man.
Right.
That's like, and that's like the literal thing of what he says. And so let's see how he reacts to Habakkuk.
Yeah.
And what he's going to say. So I'm going to read the rest of the verses that we're going to discuss today in Habakkuk 1, verses 5 through 11. Look at the nations and observe. Be utterly astounded, for I'm doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear about it. Look, I am rising up the Chaldeans, that bitter, impetuous nation that marches across the earth's open spaces to seize territories not its own. They are fierce and terrifying. Their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and more fierce than wolves of the night. Their horsemen charge ahead. Their horsemen come from distant lands. They fly like eagles, swooping to devour. All of them come to do violence. Their faces are set in determination. They gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings, and rulers are a joke to them. They laugh at every fortress and build siege ramps to capture it. Then they sweep by like the wind and pass through. They are guilty. Their strength is their God.
I don't think this is exactly what Habakkuk was thinking.
No, it's like, I think he's like, oh no, I should never have brought this up because this is worse than what we have now. So he's going to God, lamenting about the situation, and God's like, you just wait, I'm watching. And it's going to be worse than it is now. So let's put some context to that so our listeners can understand why we drew that conclusion. But I do want to point out in verse 5, when God answers him, he was like, this is what he says more literally. If you were to just kind of paraphrase that verse 5 more literally, he says, I am going to force you to look and observe. I'm going to force you to look, and then you're going to be astonished. And the cool thing about the word astonished is in the original Hebrew text, it's actually repeated. So it's like saying, be amazed, amazed.
Wow.
And he says, you're not going to believe it if I tell you. And then he tells him.
I love that.
I wonder if Habakkuk's going to believe him. We'll see. So what does he tell him?
He tells him, well, one, he's what Habakkuk will interpret as inaction of God there in Judah specifically is actually action that's taking place outside of the nation of Judah. So what he's utilizing is he's showing that his justice is going to be coming through these people that he called the Chaldeans. Now, why do you think he called them the Chaldeans?
I don't know. I know they're the Babylonians, but I don't know why he called them the Chaldeans.
We know them the Babylonians, and he would have known them as the Babylonians as well. But I think he did it on purpose because what he's doing is he's tying back to Abraham.
Okay.
And if you recall, Abraham is called out of Ur of the Chaldeans.
Oh.
And so the people group are coming in and out of. So he's already starting to blur the lines of who God will choose and see as the chosen people of God. Because at the end of the day, even though Abraham is the line through which God will bring salvation that we know, Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldeans. So even the people that Abraham came out of are part of the previous line of Abraham. So they're all seen as God's creation ultimately. Now we contextualize and go, okay, well, Jerusalem's the good people, Israel's the good people, Judah's the good people, Babylon, Egypt, these are the evil, wicked ones, the ones that deserve to fall. Well, if you believe that, then you got to go and play with Jonah and read through Jonah and understand that there's an interplay here is what happens when God treats you the way that you think he should treat your enemies. And at the end of the day, God consistently will see them all as the same. So he calls them, he's raising up the Babylonians, but he calls them the Chaldeans. And I think this is to begin to reset the mind of Habakkuk. I think it's to reset that you call them a distant, different people. But if it weren't for the Ur of the Chaldeans, you wouldn't have had the people of Israel because they wouldn't have had Abraham.
So it's showing a string of God being sovereign all along.
It's a tie. Yeah, it's a tie. Like I said, we segment, but God is blurring those lines of God, who God is here to save. Ultimately, we're given one storyline. We're not given the rest of the world storyline. We're given one through whom he will bring Jesus. And so he's raising these people up in order to show his justice. Now, I think Habakkuk probably was hoping that God would do something to, the wickedness that's taking place in Judah, but I don't think he was hoping that he would do it through another nation coming in and ultimately overtaking them,
because it's ultimately a nation that is more wicked than Judah.
Right.
So, Judah was in a bad place, but Babylon had never been in a good place. And God's not shy he doesn't sugarcoat who he's going to bring in. He knows exactly what he's doing. So he kind of refutes, he never directly says, Habakkuk, you calling me unsovereign?
Yeah.
You calling me incapable? He never directly says that, but he's like, yeah, I know. You wouldn't even believe it, but this is what I know.
Yeah.
And so he does refute Habakkuk's complaint. And one of the things he says is like, I know they take what's not theirs.
Right.
Like, I know they have their own version of mishpat,
Right.
justice. Their sovereignty, it stems from themselves.
Right.
He's not shy about that. In fact, he even says they're like wolves in the evening. You know what wolves are in the evening? Hungry and under the cover of darkness.
Oh,
that's when they're the most ravenous.
That's good.
Yeah. And so, you're going to find this really interesting. He says their faces in the CSB, which is the version I read from, he says their faces are set to determination. But in my Bible, there's a footnote that says that word determination is a little obscure, meaning they don't really know how it fits in that verse, exactly the context of it. And so I looked up the word. You know what the word for determination is? Eastward.
Oh.
Yeah. Why do you have that reaction?
Yeah.
Tell me about why that might mean something.
So east, northwest, southeast, these kind of things are gonna play important roles when it comes to unfolding narratives. And so you'll hear things like in the earliest depictions of the Hebrew scriptures, in Cain, after he murders his brother, he's going to be sent east of Eden, and there's going to be certain elements of these narratives that you're going to see things that will come from the east that will be often brought by divine ways, and you're going to see things that are going east, which often it kind of represents like people who are going farther and farther away from the presence of God, quote unquote. And so like for instance, when they built the tabernacle and the temple, the holiest of holies would be on the west side of the tabernacle and the temple, because it signified the priest heading back west, heading back towards God, heading back towards Eden. Not that the west or east have any less of a presence of God, but they just represent something thematically. Yeah. And so he's bringing something from the east. Actually, that brings up something else. So I'm always amazed at how God will just completely just destroy your own understandings and opinions. And so like here, we always read ourselves typically, or at least I do, read ourselves into like the hero spot. Here we're Habakkuk, we're the righteous ones, we're the ones crying out for God, we're not the unrighteous. God's going to take that, he's going to blur the lines by saying, oh, you think Jerusalem's bad? Well, you should see Babylon. They're even worse. And he's going to tie him tie him back to Israel, or to Judah at this time, by using the Chaldeans. So he'll call back to mind Abraham, but then he'll also use another word that he's used 3 times now in this scripture, 2 times to describe those who are in Judah, and 1 time for these ravenous wolves. And it's the Hamas word. And this time the Hamas is Babylon, or the Chaldeans. So now we've got another tie back. So the people in Judah are acting just like the unrighteous ones who are in Babylon, who don't have the Torah, who don't have God. They are not God's chosen people. And so he keeps creating these little just unbreakable bonds between Judah and between Babylon. They're not that different. And God is going to utilize the violence to do good, the violence of the Babylonian people to do good and do righteousness, to overtake the violence that Judah themselves are doing it. So now, is this a righteous violence? Like, is violence not just violence? Is it not just bad? And because he's still creating this unfolding narrative that's going to demand another violent moment, where violence in all, we have to, as human natures, let me put it this way, we would define violence as bad, period. But God will use that violence to do the ultimate good against himself. Ultimately is what he's setting up the picture for, obviously, with Jesus. And so he's interplaying this idea of like, okay, well, how can God both be punishing violence, but also utilizing violence as justice to fulfill his righteousness? And it's going to obviously leave you questioning the idea of violence and God's and God's justiceness and his working, which of course we'll see in a fulfillment with Jesus and ultimately laying himself down and allowing him to be violently, overtaken. But I think it's brilliant. Like, he is blurring every line between what is the chosen people of God in Babylon by describing them all the same way.
And I think that as the book progresses, we are going to see that while those lines are blurred, we're going to see a distinct difference in the way that God treats his people and the way that God treats Babylon and those who reject him. And the difference is going to be between discipline and wrath. And I just want to kind of put that out there. And I don't want to go into that today because I don't think we have the time, and we haven't really covered the context for that. Right. But we're going to see that, like you said, the people look a lot the same. in their sin. But God's mercy towards his people looks like discipline.
Yeah.
And God's justice towards the ungodly looks like wrath. Hello?
Hey, look, we're not
so
editing
important.
that out either.
So we needed that break, because
We
this
did.
has been, when we're almost done, but this has been kind of a tense book. This
Yeah.
is kind of a tense book. And the beginning in particular
Right.
is like I opened with that quote from Matt Chandler that Habakkuk is an uncomfortable conversation. Right. I mean, this is uncomfortable kind of stuff.
Right.
When we're talking about the questions and the accusations that Habakkuk had, and even the people groups involved, and how.
I mean, think about a modern parallel. It'd be like God telling us that, hey, America is struggling. That's okay. I'm rising up Hamas to come in and overtake you.
Yeah, and what they've done in Israel is just going to be
at least we were one nation under God at one point. Like, what was Hamas, right?
Like, and how would that be your plan?
Right.
Yeah,
I do want to tie back one more thing. He uses one specific phrase in verse 8. He says, their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. This was not just a random statement either. This would have rung very, very close to the heart of Habakkuk and anybody who was steeped in Moses' writings, because in Deuteronomy chapter 28, there is a warning that is ultimately describing what will occur, centuries before this, if the people turn their hearts away from the Lord. And it says, verse 49 of chapter 28 in Deuteronomy, the Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like an eagle, a nation whose language you don't understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. And ultimately, by him saying this, by the Lord saying this, it is calling to mind that this is not a surprise to God. This has been predicted from the start. Absolutely. If and when the people were going to fall, which they were going to do. There was not a chance that they weren't going to. And ultimately, it is God being sovereign and being wholly committed to his covenant loyalty to the people by not overlooking their unrighteousness, but fulfilling the promise that was made all those years before.
And whenever we talked about doing this book, I started reading some things and studying up on it. And one of the things one of the first things I read, the opening line was, if God is good, then why Haiti? Yeah. And I have a lot of experience in Haiti, and that's really resonated in my heart. I mean, I have wondered that, like, God, and I know I have some friends in Haiti that listen to this podcast, and I've thought, God, when it can't get any worse, it gets worse. Yeah. And not that things are peachy keen over here all the time either. Right. I mean, I've looked at, have you seen those crosses ever? I think we used to do that in front of our church that represent how many babies in our county have been aborted in 1 year. It's hundreds. Yeah. And you just think, God, why, if you're good, why? Right. Or the number of marriages broken up by pornography that has just become so accessible to the tip of our fingers. There's just so many things that we could look at. So we're not going to necessarily answer that question today, because so far in the book of Habakkuk, he really hasn't gotten an answer to his question. Yep. He has gotten God's word that he knows what's going on. Yeah. And that things are going to get worse before they get better. But I don't want to leave without having learned something about God that we can use today. And so this is what I think so far the book of Habakkuk in verses 1 through 11 have taught me about God. First of all, that God wants us to be real. I think too many times we come to God, and maybe even we come to church, and we feel like when we approach those places or his throne in prayer that we have to have it all put together. We've got to be more real with God and more real with one another, with our fellow believers. Church should be a place where where the broken come. Yeah, church should be a place where we get to be real about our struggles, real about our doubts, because God invites us to do that personally on a prayer level and corporately. And we know that because Habakkuk published that very private conversation for believers of all times and all places according to God's will. And also, I think I learned that God isn't shaken by my doubts. He isn't offended by my accusations. And you know why? Because he knows who he is. And I thought about that. There's been times where my kids have said things to me like, "You're the meanest mom in the world." I mean, they're a little older now, but I heard that when they were younger. And, I didn't like it, but it didn't like shake my foundation because I know I'm not the meanest mom in the world.
Yeah.
But if a friend, makes an accusation about an area where I may have some insecurities, that's really going to shake me, right?
Yeah.
But God has no insecurities. Like, God knows exactly who he is. So there's no accusation that you can bring against him that's going to offend him. There's no question or doubt that you can bring to him that is going to shake him. He knows exactly who he is. So bring them to him.
Can I end with a challenge?
Absolutely.
So if you're in Habakkuk's time and you're hearing this response from God, you have so many things that have got to be running through your head. There were certain elements of God's promises that are at play here. One of which was made to Abraham, that he will make them a great nation, that they will bless those that, bless them and curse those that curse them. So the question is, where's this nation? Then the other question would be, well, where is this figure that is a descendant of David who's going to come in and ultimately set up a kingdom forever? Well, right now he's talking about the destruction of the final last portion of these people and stuff. So he's got to be worried about what about the promises of God, and those kind of things have to be questions. Well, it's in these moments that you can get little glimpses that once you start to see it, you'll begin to see that God is trying to refocus that lens through which Habakkuk is looking through. So we've tied a couple different times to both Genesis and to both Abraham specifically. So my challenge for you, and I'll make it really easy, after verse 8, so you only have a couple verses to deal with. After verse 8, he winks one more time. He uses one certain phrase that continually hammers down the fact that he wants him to refocus his mindset back to Abraham specifically, and the people that Abraham that and the promise that God will make to Abraham in that this great nation. That even though this great nation may be falling, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about this promise I made to Abraham. So after verse 8, I want you to look for one phrase there.
Okay, so it's going to be in verses 9, 10, or 11.
Yes.
Is what you're saying. And it's a reference
It's
or
one more little, and I love to call it this, it's just a wink.
Okay.
It's just one little wink that's like, oh, that phrase has been used before.
Okay.
And it very specifically in this context.
So comment on our Facebook post of this feed, or this episode, if you get the wink in verses 9, 10, or 11 back to Abraham.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's great.
All right. So you want to close us in a word of prayer?
Absolutely. Let's pray. Father God, thank you so much for your word. We're glad to be back doing the podcast. I pray that it's honoring to you, God, that we can spawn a curiosity in the mindset of the reader and the listener, God, and that we can glean from this the multiple things that you want us to learn, God, and that you are just, that you are righteous, God, that you're in control, you're sovereign. None of this stuff surprises you. None of this stuff shakes you, even though it shakes us. But God, ultimately, we will truly begin to continue to discover that this has all been part of your plans from the start, and that we have hope in who you are and what you've done for us through your son, Jesus. God, we just ask that you'll protect us this week, bring us back as we continue to study Habakkuk in the coming weeks. We ask you in your name. Amen.